In the heart of downtown Chicago, a busy corporate office buzzed with activity. The building was sleek, modern, and filled with employees who were always racing against deadlines. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a new face in the office. He had recently joined as a consultant, bringing with him an impressive resume that included degrees from top universities and years of experience in the industry. Despite his qualifications, Marcus quickly noticed something unsettling. Some of his colleagues didn't take him seriously. It wasn't hard to see why. Marcus was a black man working in an environment where racial biases still lingered beneath the surface. While no one outright said anything offensive, he often felt the weight of subtle slights. For instance, during team meetings, some coworkers would glance at each other when he spoke as if silently questioning his expertise. Others seemed hesitant to include him in important discussions or dismissed his ideas without much thought. At first, Marcus brushed it off, chalking it up to the usual challenges of being the new guy. But over time, these small actions started to add up. One person stood out more than the rest: Greg Peterson. Greg was a mid-level manager known for his loud personality and confidence, sometimes bordering on arrogance. He prided himself on being a go-getter, someone who got things done no matter what. However, Greg also had a habit of looking down on those he considered beneath him. And unfortunately for Marcus, Greg seemed determined to make sure everyone knew he didn't think much of him. Greg's behavior wasn't overtly hostile, at least not in a way that could get him into trouble, but it was clear enough for Marcus to notice. During brainstorming sessions, Greg would interrupt Marcus mid-sentence, cutting him off with comments like, "Let me clarify what you're trying to say," even though Marcus was perfectly capable of explaining himself. Other times, Greg would roll his eyes or sigh dramatically whenever Marcus offered input, making it obvious he didn't value his contributions. What made this situation particularly ironic was something none of Greg's coworkers realized. Marcus wasn't just another employee. In fact, he was far from it. Unbeknownst to almost everyone in the office, Marcus had been handpicked by the parent company's board of directors to evaluate how well their subsidiary operated. His role as a consultant was merely a cover, allowing him to observe day-to-day interactions and identify areas for improvement. More importantly, Marcus held a secret title. He was the newly appointed CEO of the parent company itself. This revelation hadn't been shared with anyone yet. The plan was simple: spend a few weeks embedded in the office, gather insights, and then step into his official role once the assessment period ended. Until then, Marcus chose to keep his true identity hidden, knowing that observing the workplace dynamics firsthand would provide invaluable information. But staying quiet wasn't easy, especially when faced with constant disrespect from someone like Greg. Despite the frustration brewing inside him, Marcus remained calm and professional. He understood that reacting emotionally wouldn't solve anything. It might even undermine his mission. Instead, he focused on proving his worth through action. Whenever Greg tried to belittle him, Marcus responded with patience and logic, showing that he wasn't intimidated. He continued to share thoughtful ideas, contribute meaningfully to projects, and build relationships with his colleagues, all while quietly documenting every interaction. The tension between Marcus and Greg grew thicker with each passing day. Coworkers began to pick up on it too, though they weren't sure what to make of the situation. Some admired Marcus's composure, wondering how he managed to stay so composed in the face of such blatant disrespect. Others sympathized with him, but kept their distance, unwilling to risk crossing Greg, who had a reputation for holding grudges. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of what he was experiencing. He knew that prejudice wasn't unique to this office. It existed everywhere, often manifesting in ways that were hard to pinpoint or address directly. What bothered him most was how easily people jumped to conclusions based on appearances rather than substance. Here he was, a highly accomplished professional with years of success behind him, yet some of his colleagues refused to acknowledge his capabilities simply because of the color of his skin. Still, Marcus refused to let negativity consume him. He reminded himself why he was there: to create change. By enduring Greg's behavior and maintaining his professionalism, he hoped to expose the cracks in the system and pave the way for a better workplace culture. Little did he know, his patience was about to pay off in ways he hadn't anticipated. The stage was set for a dramatic turn of events, one that would leave everyone reeling and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their organization. The tension between Marcus and Greg reached a boiling point one afternoon during a crucial strategy meeting. The room was packed with employees, all gathered to discuss the next big project that could potentially boost the company's profits. Marcus had spent hours preparing for this moment, analyzing data, and crafting a detailed proposal that he believed would revolutionize the way the team approached their work. He knew his idea was solid. It wasn't just theoretical. It was practical, actionable, and backed by evidence. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood confidently at the front of the room, his voice calm but firm as he outlined his plan. He explained how streamlining certain processes and reallocating resources could save the company both time and money while improving overall efficiency. His presentation was thorough, and he answered questions from the audience with ease, demonstrating a deep understanding of the topic. For a brief moment, Marcus felt hopeful. Maybe this time his ideas would finally be taken seriously. But then Greg spoke up. Sitting near the back of the room with his arms crossed, Greg leaned forward in his chair and let out a dismissive chuckle. "That idea sounds like something someone without real-world experience would come up with," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. His tone dripped with condescension, and there was a smirk on his face as if he'd just delivered the perfect punchline. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Marcus, waiting to see how he would respond. Some colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uneasy about Greg's comment. Others avoided making eye contact altogether, unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of it. Meanwhile, Greg looked around the room, basking in what he thought was a clever takedown. To him, this was just another opportunity to assert his dominance and remind everyone who was in charge. Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to give Greg the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Instead, he chose to handle the situation with grace. "I appreciate your feedback, Greg," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Perhaps we can discuss this further after I've had more time to review additional data." With that, he wrapped up his presentation and returned to his seat, leaving the room buzzing with quiet whispers. Greg's smirk widened, clearly pleased with himself. In his mind, he'd won. He'd publicly undermined Marcus and reinforced his own authority in front of the entire team. What Greg failed to realize, however, was that his actions were being closely monitored, not only by Marcus but also by other senior executives watching the meeting remotely via video feed. Unbeknownst to Greg, the parent company's board of directors had been observing the division's operations for some time now. They wanted to ensure that their decision to appoint Marcus as CEO was the right one, and part of that involved evaluating how employees interacted with each other. When Greg's disrespectful remark echoed through the conference room, it sent shockwaves far beyond what anyone present could have imagined. Later that evening, Marcus received a call from one of the board members. "We saw what happened today," the director said, his tone serious. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, even though the director couldn't see him. "I'm fine," he replied. "But I think this incident highlights a bigger issue within the organization," the director agreed. "You're absolutely right. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and it needs to be addressed. But remember, your cover isn't supposed to be blown yet. Let's stick to the plan for now and use this as an opportunity to gather more evidence." Marcus understood the importance of patience. He knew that confronting Greg directly at this stage wouldn't serve any purpose. It might even jeopardize the investigation. Instead, he decided to let events unfold naturally, trusting that justice would prevail in due time. Over the next few days, Marcus continued to document every interaction with Greg, noting not just the overt insults but also the subtle microaggressions that others might overlook. He paid attention to how Greg treated other employees too, especially those from underrepresented groups. It became increasingly clear that Greg's behavior wasn't isolated to Marcus alone. It was part of a broader pattern of disrespect and entitlement. As Marcus gathered more information, he couldn't help but reflect on the impact such attitudes had on workplace culture. People like Greg created environments where fear and mistrust thrived, stifling creativity and collaboration. Employees who felt undervalued were less likely to share their ideas or take risks, which ultimately hurt the company as a whole. Marcus knew that addressing these issues wouldn't be. That evening, after the tense strategy meeting, Marcus attended a private dinner with members of the board of directors. The setting was elegant, a quiet, upscale restaurant where they could speak freely without interruptions. As plates of gourmet food were served, the conversation turned to Marcus's ongoing evaluation of the division. The board was eager to hear his initial findings, especially since he had been working undercover for several weeks now. Marcus didn't mince words. He began by outlining the strengths of the division: talented employees, innovative ideas, and a strong potential for growth. But then he shifted gears, addressing the elephant in the room, the toxic culture that lurked beneath the surface. "There's a lack of inclusivity here," Marcus explained, his tone measured but firm. "Some individuals feel entitled to dismiss others based on biases rather than merit. It creates an environment where collaboration suffers and morale plummets." To illustrate his point, Marcus recounted the incident with Greg during the strategy meeting earlier that day. He described how Greg had openly mocked his proposal, dismissing it with a condescending remark in front of the entire team. "It wasn't just unprofessional, it was disrespectful," Marcus said. "And unfortunately, it's not an isolated event. This kind of behavior has become normalized in the office." The board members listened intently, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. One director leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "We've seen similar patterns in other divisions," she admitted. "But hearing about it firsthand makes it even more alarming. What do you think needs to happen next?" Marcus paused before responding, choosing his words carefully. "I believe this is an opportunity to address systemic issues within the organization," he said. "People like Greg aren't just problematic because of their individual actions. They're symptomatic of a larger problem. We need to foster a culture where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of their background or position." Another director chimed in, suggesting that Marcus use the situation as a teachable moment. "You have the power to set an example," he said. "By confronting these behaviors head-on, you can send a clear message about what we expect from our leaders and what won't be tolerated moving forward." While Marcus appreciated the advice, he reminded the group that maintaining his anonymity was critical for the remainder of the assessment period, which still had 2 weeks left. Breaking cover prematurely could compromise the integrity of his investigation. Instead, he proposed letting events unfold naturally, while continuing to document instances of misconduct. Once the evaluation was complete, he would step into his official role as CEO and implement meaningful changes. As the dinner wrapped up, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The board's support reinforced his belief that real change was possible, but it wouldn't come easily. He knew that addressing ingrained biases required patience, persistence, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. And while he understood the importance of staying undercover for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Back at the office the following week, life went on as usual, or so it seemed. Greg remained oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. If anything, his behavior grew worse. Emboldened by his earlier public takedown of Marcus, Greg became even more brazen in his attempts to assert dominance. He started excluding Marcus from important email chains, leaving him out of key project updates and subtly undermining his contributions whenever possible. Other employees began to notice the tension between the two men. Some whispered about it in hushed tones during coffee breaks, speculating about why Greg seemed so determined to target Marcus. A few colleagues tried to intervene, offering Marcus support or apologizing on Greg's behalf. But Marcus simply smiled, and reassured them that everything was fine. "Don't worry about me," he'd say. "I'm just focused on doing my job." What Greg failed to realize was that his actions weren't going unnoticed. Senior leadership continued to monitor the situation closely, gathering evidence of his unprofessional conduct. Meanwhile, rumors about Marcus's true identity began to circulate among the staff. Sharp-eyed employees picked up on subtle clues, like how upper management treated him with unusual deference or included him in high-level meetings despite his consultant title. Speculation ran rampant, though no one dared to ask Marcus directly. Through it all, Marcus remained composed, using every interaction as an opportunity to observe and learn. He documented each instance of disrespect, noting not only Greg's behavior but also how it affected team dynamics. Employees who witnessed Greg's antics often hesitated to share their own ideas, fearing ridicule or dismissal. Others withdrew entirely, retreating into silence rather than risk drawing attention to themselves. It was clear that Greg's actions were having a ripple effect, eroding trust and stifling innovation across the board. Despite the challenges, Marcus refused to let negativity consume him. He reminded himself daily that this experience was part of something bigger, a chance to create lasting change. Every insult, every exclusion, every eye roll, it all fueled his determination to build a workplace where everyone could thrive. And as the days ticked closer to the end of his undercover assignment, Marcus prepared himself for the moment when he would finally reveal his true identity and confront the issues head-on. Little did Greg know, his arrogance was setting the stage for a dramatic reckoning. When the truth came to light, it wouldn't just be Marcus standing tall. It would be an entire organization ready to embrace a brighter, more inclusive future. Until then, Marcus bided his time, knowing that the best way to win wasn't through confrontation but through preparation. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the whole picture would become clear. As the days passed, whispers began to ripple through the office like a quiet breeze turning into a steady wind. At first, it was just small talk, casual observations. That seemed harmless enough but carried an undercurrent of curiosity. Employees started noticing things about Marcus that didn't quite add up with his supposed role as a consultant. For instance, there were the subtle nods of respect from visiting executives who stopped by unannounced, or the way Marcus was invited to closed-door meetings usually reserved for senior leadership, while others in similar roles were left out. One day, during a routine team lunch, Sarah, a mid-level manager known for her sharp instincts, leaned closer to her colleagues and said, "Have you noticed how everyone seems to treat Marcus differently? It's almost like he's more important than he lets on." Her words hung in the air, sparking a flurry of reactions. Some dismissed her theory outright, laughing it off as paranoia or overthinking. Others, however, couldn't help but agree. There was something unusual about Marcus, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. Greg, of course, remained oblivious. His inflated ego blinded him to these details, leaving him convinced that his earlier insults had successfully put Marcus in his place. If anything, Greg doubled down on his behavior, growing bolder in his attempts to marginalize Marcus. He openly questioned Marcus's decisions during group discussions, often phrasing his critiques in ways that came across as patronizing. "Are you sure this is the best approach?" Greg would ask, raising an eyebrow as if challenging Marcus to defend himself. But Marcus didn't take the bait. Instead, he continued to handle every situation with calm professionalism, never letting Greg's jabs rattle him. This only added to the mystery surrounding him. How could someone so clearly disrespected remain so composed? Why didn't Marcus fight back or demand recognition? These questions lingered in the minds of many employees, fueling even more speculation. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Marcus was meticulously documenting everything. Each snide comment, each exclusion from critical emails, each dismissive gesture, it all went into a detailed report that painted a vivid picture of Greg's unprofessional conduct. But Marcus wasn't just focused on Greg, he was also paying attention to how other employees reacted to the toxic environment Greg helped create. Some stayed silent out of fear, while others mimicked Greg's behavior, perpetuating the cycle of disrespect. Marcus knew that addressing Greg alone wouldn't solve the problem. He needed to tackle the root causes of the division's cultural issues. The rumors about Marcus reached a tipping point when a new batch of executives arrived for a surprise visit. They walked straight past Greg, who was expecting to lead the tour, and headed directly toward Marcus. One of them shook Marcus's hand warmly, saying, "Good to see you again, Mr. Thompson. Let's get started." The casual ease with which the executive addressed Marcus sent shockwaves through the room. Everyone froze, exchanging bewildered glances. Was Marcus really as high-ranking as these executives seemed to think? Greg, standing nearby, felt a flicker of unease for the first time. He tried brushing it off, telling himself it was probably nothing. After all, consultants sometimes worked closely with executives. That didn't mean Marcus was special. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, gnawing at the edges of Greg's confidence. Over the next few days, Greg's behavior took a darker turn. Feeling threatened by the growing whispers about Marcus, he became increasingly aggressive in his efforts to assert control. He excluded Mark. The day of reckoning arrived on a crisp Monday morning, 2 weeks after the incident in the strategy meeting. The entire division was summoned to an emergency town hall gathering, scheduled with little warning. Employees filed into the conference room, their faces etched with curiosity and unease. No one knew exactly why they had been called, but the presence of visiting executives from headquarters added an air of urgency that made everyone uneasy. Greg entered the room last as usual, his confident stride betraying none of the anxiety he might have felt. He scanned the crowd, nodding at a few colleagues before taking his seat near the back. His eyes briefly met Marcus's, who sat quietly at the front of the room, calmly observing everything around him. Greg smirked, still convinced that Marcus was beneath him, a mere consultant whose contributions were irrelevant. As the room settled into silence, a senior executive stepped up to the podium. She greeted everyone warmly, but wasted no time getting to the point. "We've brought you all here today because we believe transparency is critical for growth," she began. "Over the past several weeks, we've been conducting an evaluation of this division's operations, leadership, and overall culture. What we've learned will shape the future of this organization, and it starts now." With that, she gestured toward Marcus, inviting him to take the stage. The room erupted into murmurs as Marcus rose from his seat, adjusting his tie before stepping forward. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he exuded authority and poise. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the anticipation build as dozens of eyes locked onto him. Then, with a calm yet commanding voice, he introduced himself. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he began, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "And I am the newly appointed CEO of our parent company." A collective gasp swept through the room. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to get a better look at Marcus. Some exchanged astonished glances while others whispered furiously to their neighbors. All eyes eventually turned to Greg, whose smug expression had vanished, replaced by sheer disbelief. His face paled as realization dawned. He had spent weeks openly disrespecting the very person who held ultimate power over his career. Marcus continued, unfazed by the shock rippling through the audience. "I came here undercover to gain firsthand insight into how this division operates," he explained. "What I've seen has been both inspiring and concerning. On one hand, I've witnessed incredible talent, dedication, and potential within this team. On the other hand, I've observed behaviors that undermine collaboration, innovation, and inclusivity." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. Then, without hesitation, he addressed the elephant in the room. "Let me be clear. Respect is non-negotiable. It doesn't matter your title, tenure, or background. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Yet during my time here, I've experienced repeated instances of disrespect and exclusion. These actions aren't just unprofessional, they harm morale, stifle creativity, and erode trust." Marcus went on to describe specific examples, including Greg's behavior during meetings and his dismissive attitude toward ideas that didn't align with his own. He recounted moments when Greg interrupted him, mocked his proposals and excluded him from important communications. Each example landed like a hammer blow, leaving Greg visibly shaken as coworkers turned to glance at him accusingly. But Marcus didn't stop there. He broadened the conversation to address systemic issues within the organization. This isn't just about one individual, he emphasized. It's about a culture that allows such behavior to persist unchecked. We must do better, for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for the success of this company. His speech struck a chord with many in the room. Employees nodded in agreement, some even clapping softly, as Marcus outlined his vision for change. He announced plans to implement new initiatives aimed at fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. Anonymous feedback channels would be established to give employees a safe space to voice concerns. Regular workshops on unconscious bias and cultural competency would become mandatory for all staff. And perhaps most importantly, accountability. Measures would be put in place to ensure that disrespectful behavior was addressed swiftly and decisively. When Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. It was clear that his message had resonated deeply with the majority of the team. Even those who had previously doubted him now looked at him with admiration and respect. As Marcus stepped away from the podium, the visiting executives joined, him on stage offering supportive smiles and handshakes. For Greg, however, the moment was nothing short of devastating. He sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. How could he have been so blind, so arrogant? The man he had ridiculed and dismissed was now standing above him, holding the power to shape not only his professional future but also the entire trajectory of the company. As the meeting concluded, employees lingered in the room, buzzing with excitement and relief. Conversations erupted everywhere, with many expressing gratitude for Marcus's courage and leadership. Others admitted feeling vindicated, having long suspected that something wasn't right with the way Greg treated people. A few approached, Marcus personally to thank him, their voices filled with sincerity. Greg, meanwhile, slipped out of the room unnoticed, his confidence shattered. He retreated to his desk where he sat alone, staring blankly at his computer screen. The reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. Not only had he insulted the new CEO, but he had done so publicly, in front of the entire division. There was no denying the gravity of his mistake or its consequences. Later that afternoon, Greg was summoned to a closed-door meeting with HR and senior leadership. The atmosphere was tense as they reviewed the documented evidence of his misconduct. They reminded him that his behavior was unacceptable and damaging to the organization. While termination wasn't immediately on the table, Greg was placed on probation and stripped of several responsibilities. Mandatory sensitivity training became a condition of his continued employment. As news of Greg's punishment spread, the Marumai office breathed a collective sigh of relief. Employees felt empowered, knowing that their voices mattered and that leadership was committed to creating a better workplace. For Marcus, the grand reveal marked the beginning of a new chapter. One, defined by accountability, growth, and transformation. Little did anyone know the changes he envisioned were only just beginning to take root. In the days following Marcus's dramatic reveal, the office underwent a seismic shift. The once tense atmosphere began to ease as employees realized that real change was finally on the horizon. For many, Marcus's speech wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a promise that their voices would no longer be ignored. Morale improved almost overnight, with people feeling more empowered to share ideas and collaborate openly. However, not everyone emerged unscathed from the fallout. Greg Peterson, now stripped of his authority and placed under strict probation, struggled to find his footing. His reputation, which he had spent years building, lay in ruins. Colleagues who once admired his brash confidence now avoided him, embarrassed by association. During team meetings, Greg sat quietly, his usual swagger replaced by a palpable sense of shame. He knew he had dug this hole for himself, but escaping it seemed nearly impossible. HR wasted no time implementing corrective measures. Greg was required to attend weekly sensitivity training sessions designed to help him recognize and address his biases. At first, he approached these sessions reluctantly, often rolling his eyes or checking his phone when the facilitator spoke. But over time, something started to sink in. Hearing firsthand accounts from colleagues about how his behavior had affected them forced Greg to confront uncomfortable truths. One particularly candid session involved an intern who tearfully recounted how Greg's dismissive attitude during a project review had crushed her confidence. "I stopped speaking up after that," she admitted. "I didn't want to embarrass myself again." That moment struck a nerve with Greg. For the first time, he saw the human impact of his actions, not just as abstract complaints but as real pain inflicted on others. It wasn't easy for him to process, but it planted the seeds of reflection. Slowly, painfully, Greg began to understand why his behavior had been so damaging. Meanwhile, Marcus wasted no time putting his plans into action. Within days of the town hall meeting, new policies were rolled out across the division. Anonymous feedback channels allowed employees to report issues without fear of retaliation. Regular workshops focused on fostering empathy and understanding became mandatory for all staff, from entry-level interns to senior managers. Marcus also introduced mentorship programs aimed at supporting underrepresented groups within the organization, ensuring that everyone had access to opportunities for growth. These changes didn't happen overnight, nor were they universally embraced at first. Some employees grumbled about the additional training requirements, viewing them as unnecessary interruptions to their busy schedules. Others remained skeptical, wondering if the initiatives were merely performative gestures rather than genuine efforts toward improvement. But Marcus stayed committed, leading by example and engaging directly with employees to address concerns. One of the most significant transformations came in the form of open dialogue. Months had passed since Marcus Thompson stepped into his role as CEO, and the office was nearly unrecognizable from the tense, divided workplace it once was. The air buzzed with energy, not the frantic kind driven by deadlines, but a vibrant sense of purpose and collaboration. Employees greeted each other warmly in the hallways, shared ideas freely during meetings, and worked together seamlessly on projects. The transformation wasn't just superficial, it ran deep, touching every corner of the organization. Marcus's leadership philosophy became the heartbeat of the company. He often reminded his team that success wasn't measured solely by numbers or profits. It was about creating an environment where people felt valued, heard, and empowered to thrive. Under his guidance, the division implemented policies that prioritized inclusivity and transparency. Regular check-ins ensured that employees could voice concerns without fear of judgment, while recognition programs celebrated contributions big and small. These changes fostered a culture of mutual respect, one that inspired innovation and strengthened morale. For Greg Peterson, the journey toward redemption continued to unfold. While he still carried the weight of his past actions, he approached his work with renewed determination. His efforts to change hadn't gone unnoticed. Slowly, colleagues began to see glimpses of the person he was striving to become. During team meetings, Greg actively encouraged quieter members to share their thoughts, showing genuine interest in their perspectives. When conflicts arose, he listened instead of reacting defensively, demonstrating a level of patience and empathy that few thought possible. One pivotal moment came when Greg volunteered to lead a workshop on unconscious bias. Standing before a room full of skeptical faces, he admitted, "I used to think I didn't have biases. I thought I was above all that. But I was wrong. And because of my ignorance, I hurt people who deserved better." His honesty struck a chord, earning him cautious applause and a few nods of approval. It wasn't forgiveness, he knew he didn't deserve that yet, but it was acknowledgement, and for Greg, that meant everything. As time went on, Greg found himself mentoring younger employees, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. He shared stories of his own struggles, not to excuse his behavior, but to emphasize the importance of accountability and growth. His mentees admired his willingness to be vulnerable, seeing him not as someone perfect, but as someone human. This new role gave Greg a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced before, proving that even those who stray far from the path can find their way back. The ripple effects of Marcus's leadership extended beyond individual transformations. They reshaped the entire organization. Other divisions within the parent company took note of the remarkable turnaround and sought to replicate its success. Executives visited regularly, eager to learn how Marcus had managed to spark such profound change. What they discovered was simple yet powerful. True leadership starts with listening. By taking the time to understand the challenges faced by employees at every level, Marcus had built a foundation of trust that allowed meaningful progress to flourish. But perhaps the most significant impact was felt by the employees themselves. For years, many had resigned themselves to the belief that speaking up would only invite ridicule or dismissal. Now, they realized their voices mattered, and that leadership was committed to hearing them. Junior staffers who had once hesitated to contribute ideas were now presenting bold proposals during strategy sessions. Mid-level managers collaborated across departments, breaking down silos that had long hindered progress. Even senior executives embraced the shift, recognizing that fostering inclusivity wasn't just the right thing to do. It was good for business. Marcus watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would still be challenges, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But what mattered most was the collective commitment to moving forward, together. In staff meetings, he often quoted a phrase that had guided him through his own journey. Progress isn't perfection, it's persistence. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the office, he paused by the large glass windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled, like stars against the darkening sky, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much farther they could go. Behind him, the office hummed with activity, a testament to the hard work and resilience of everyone who had embraced the call for change. In that moment, Marcus reflected on the lessons he'd learned along the way. He understood now more than ever that leadership wasn't about wielding authority. It was about empowering others to rise. It was about creating spaces where differences weren't just tolerated, but celebrated. And it was about recognizing that every person, regardless of title or background, had something valuable to offer. As he turned off the light and headed home, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the team that had stood by him, for the individuals who had dared to challenge the status quo, and for the opportunity to make a difference. The journey wasn't over. It might never truly end, but every step forward brought them closer to the vision they shared. A workplace defined not by hierarchy or division, but by unity and purpose. And somewhere in the building, Greg Peterson sat at his desk, drafting an email to thank Marcus for giving him a second chance. Though the words didn't come easily, he knew they needed to be said, because sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the greatest growth, and in the end, it's the choices we make that define us, not the mistakes we've made.